I am Joel Boyce Sr., and I was born in 1920 in a beautiful little town in Utah, thoroughly Mormon, thoroughly pioneer stock. It was beautiful, surrounded by mountains, snow-capped mountains, and everybody there seemed to be related, aunts and uncles. In fact, half the town were my relatives. My grandfather had two wives and 21 children. My grandmother, sweet, shy, married at 16, had 13 children. And that was a complicated time in the time of polygamy when they were persecuting polygamists. So there are a lot of stories of the people on the Morgan side of the Davis County mountains who would hear the feds were making a raid, and they would travel over the hills and mountains passes to Bountiful and seek refuge there. And there was one house there by a lady that was sort of an universal aunt, Aunt Kate Chase at Kate Chase Park. And the men would come from Morgan and stand in her house and try to be quiet and concealed. And once there was stories of the federal marshals knocking on her door, and it opened up, and the man looked inside, and inside, unbeknownst to the government man, were some polygamous men hiding behind each folded door. Wow. And there were stories like that, but that's a small part. Really, I remember my grandfather and the culture that surrounded it with much sweetness and rightness and sacrifice for each other. The two wives got along very well. One was named Sarah and one was named Martha, and Martha was my grandmother. Lovely biblical names.
Okay. So exactly how old does that make you now?
I'm 93, and I feel like 193. And my life has been really quite a treasure. If I could unravel it all, I would have quite an interesting historical span in the life that I have led. I was growing up in Salt Lake City as a child, and the papers and things were memorializing World War I. And it was a time when there were some lurid accounts and personal survivors and veterans who would talk about the butchery of the trench warfare. And that's what meant, in my mind, war, that people aimlessly would be guided into huge numbers, clashing against each other. And one general even had the opinion that there were a few more survivors of these trench warfare episodes on one side than on the other. So if the war just continued, one side would have a few more survivors and therefore be the winner. That's what kind of stupidity and ingrained behavior accompanied the war, and that World War I was what formed my views of war even as a child.
How old were you during World War
I wasn't born yet, but it was just a recent, in the past memory. Mm-hmm. Vietnam is now 60 or 70 years back, but then it was 5 or 6 years away from my own time. So that determined a great shape of my life from then on, because when I was in junior high school, I was president of the student body and had to preside over weekly assemblies, and each one I was given the privilege or the job of a little speech to all the students, and every one of them was anti-war and talking about war, and that never changed in my whole life. when it came time for World War II to come along, I could see and feel it coming, and it was an interesting time. I was in college, but I was also still anti-war, so I registered as a conscientious objector, which is my main definition of me in that aspect of living a life. And I was sent to a concentration camp, which is the only real way to describe it. And for there, a year and a half of hard labor, no provision for dependents. I had a wife and baby at home. But after that, I went into the Army Medical Corps, and it was really an easier way to be in the Army than to be in the CO camp. But that has been very important to me at all times. And you look back at the times, and there's always the question, well, how would you confront the Nazi killing machines? Somebody should resist. Well, they did, but the problem was we ended up, in the geopolitical terms, supporting Russia. And Russia had a record of more deaths and being responsible for millions of deaths, as were the Nazis, but more than the Nazis. So to support one side meant you had to embrace the evil that went with it, that is, with Stalinism. Now, I wasn't thinking so much in those terms. I was just thinking of the insanity of war, of men just brainlessly, mindlessly killing and piling up corpses. And somebody they had no personal grudge against, meeting on the battleground and fighting to the very end. And that seemed to be what war was. And as the war progressed, it just confirmed my view that the only sane way to confront these things was to stay as far away from actually involving and working in these army and military units, because we ended up with huge mechanized cavalcades, armor, tanks, and at one point toward the last third of the war, we had America aerial superiority. So there was a complete, announced and fervently pursued policy of civilian casualties in the Germans, among the Germans. And then we went on a campaign to exterminate city by city when they didn't have the means to defend. And so I was quite well aware of the details of what they went through in those cities. And somebody up there back home that are heroes, they're flyboys and all, but the actual results of their work was suffocation in the German aircraft units, and just the terrible bombing and the incendiary clouds of bombs applied against the German cities. And there was simply, as happens in war, a lack of sympathy, a lack of understanding, a lack of empathy for what was being suffered on the ground below. There were mothers trying to protect their children. There were citizens not necessarily connected to German military who were going through terrible privations and hardships. And then the Germans in that same war turned east toward Russia and they had that awful, might have been the most difficult, terrible, hardship type of warfare in Stalingrad. They would shoot each other and chase each other in and out of their apartments. The snows would come. The Germans were starving and freezing to death. So that's one other aspect of the war. Well, I am sorry to say I find a little more pessimism than earlier in my life. I think in personal terms it was to try to find out just what was the purpose of life, what is the kind of world we're living in, and how other people have proven the profitable and rewarding ways to live, and those that have not. So I have wandered over many parts of the world, and when I was in Russia, I was very thoughtful as I watched the ceremony of the unknown soldier before the tomb of the unknown soldier, and the solemn ways the Russians would remember their dead, 20 million Russians dead, and so forth. So all over Germany, I'd do the same. I'd go into these little churchyards or the town monument to the unknown soldier, and I spent many a very pensive moment in those places and graves, and seeing just what impact this thing had on the lives of one generation after another. In Germany, I saw in the unknown soldier monument the names of the father, and the names of the son, and the names of the grandfather, all killed in successive wars. And it added to my thoughtfulness about the whole problem. I have had an unusual breadth of experience with many parts of the world, not any particularly exotic or strange parts, but just the main aspects of the world. I've been on South Sea Islands. I've been in Sri Lanka, that's old Ceylon, for 6 months at a time, and absorbing that kind of a culture and place it was, and coming to understand other ways of society organizing itself. And all of that was made possible by my wife's willingness to carry on things at home. I found I could travel and be on these trips almost every 7 years. I was granted a full sabbatical, and I took it. And my wife was willing and self-sacrificing enough to make that possible. And that's one of the things I'm sorry about. If I could just hold her in my arms and express what she meant to me, express my love. And I'm sure I seemed like kind of a non-sensitive kind of a husband to her, and I could have provided her with every kind of reassurance and love that she needed.
We were talking about Grandma and how much sacrifice she had done, and you were saying if you could have the chance to hold her in your arms and tell her how much she meant to you. Let's just imagine that she were here. What would you say to her?
Well, I would have a completely different feeling about it. She always had the next life and eternity and completely religious confidence, and I would now have the perspective of her viewpoint and mine and the life we'd led, how terribly full of significance every moment is, and the depth of relationship. I needed to have added to her problems and solutions and her comfort and her reassurance the whole time of our marriage. She was such a strong person, I just took it for granted that she was making her way and making a strong imprint upon her children and upon and having a life. So I would just be holding her in my arms with a feeling of what eternity meant to her. I've always been just a little on the questioning and skeptical side and the reserving of judgment, but not her. And I could have reassured her that what she held important was something we shared deeply. Anyway, I am grateful. You see the good years when we had shared times in Idaho and at the cabin. I built two lovely big cabins with my own labor, and the family would gather there. Everybody would, all my relatives and nieces and nephews had experiences there, and that was a marvelous part of life too. I feel about dying a little bit like regret at the common, wonderful, miraculous things of everyday living, the normal things that poets feel, the grass and flowers and trees and sky, waking up every day. I regret. I'll miss that just as one would miss any part of being alive, but at the same time, I will take solace and comfort now in the knowledge that that's all coming to an end, and it's appropriate that it should, this mortal part of it. I am increasingly worried over what kind of a world you in your generation is going to face. I have a feeling that things are going to be much more serious, much more of a struggle, much more giving up of hopes and goals than you had ever imagined. What with the overpopulation of the earth and the growing droughts and famines and areas of life, and the willingness for people to still slaughter one another in enormous numbers. We're living under the shadow of nuclear bombing still. There's been some very close calls, and there still may yet come, and as more irresponsible nations get the ability to set off a nuclear bomb, we'll almost surely have to experience that in the future. And that's a chilling, terrible prospect. And I think that I can hardly advise my descendants anymore to have multiple, unlimited children and babies. It's too forbidding and perilous a prospect ahead.
If you had the chance to tell the whole world something, if the whole world could hear you share something, what would you share with the whole world?
I would say what's important are human values and human command of those things that we have that are God-given gifts, really, and that's language, poetry, and music, and those are marvelous, cherished fruits of civilization. But I would just hope for some understanding of the impulse toward war and destruction that men have. I've often been concerned with something in the Book of Mormon. I have certain reservations about that whole framework, but nevertheless they overlook the fact that it's not just the story of a couple of civilizations that disregarded commandments and religious and spiritual living, but in the end there are some detailed accounts of great armies fighting, slaughtering, and returning at night after exhaustion and bleeding, the next day to resume the slaughter. And the next day, the Book of Mormon says there are millions involved in that. And that, to me, is one of the messages of the Book of Mormon that people don't see, is the story of man's willingness to slaughter to the last breath and to the last survivor. So that's part of my insight about that part of the Book of Mormon.
So if you had a chance to talk to the whole world, you would tell them to?
Well, to take heed of the real lessons and to be aware of these great drifts, forces of society, as Eisenhower called them, the industrial military complex. We're thoroughly in the grip of those things, and it goes outside. Our politics is largely some kind of manipulation and ignorance and antipathy. There's not enough goodwill, there's not enough appreciation for the simple accomplishments and the simple lives of people. We don't need to think of the lives of the greedy billionaires or anybody that are so admired in our society. We just need to see how important it is that people realize the common good and a civil, meaningful civilization with no one trying to own the whole world, as many billionaires seem to feel.
So what do you think then is the purpose of life?
Well, at this point, I'm not sure. If I took a normal attitude, I would say what would be possible, of course, just an orderly, civilized, always progressing, valuing education, valuing family life, and valuing the good simple things that good people can represent to one another.